Good evening. Welcome to the Border Zone Project. Thank you for joining us today. Today with us, Mr. Mike Carpenter, director of the Penn Biden Center. We're in very beautiful hotel, Sheraton Meteche Palace in Tbilisi, and you came here because of the conference, ongoing conference about Russian influence on post-Soviet space. Could you please tell me, first thing, why do you think that it is, in general, it is important and needed to discuss such kind of topic nowadays in 2019? And what are the main subjects of discussion, for example, your statements?
Well, I think it's crucial right now to focus on this issue of Russian hybrid war and malign influence, because not only is Russia doubling down on its efforts to weaken democracies across the region, but a lot of times the publics in these countries, including here in Georgia, but also in my country, in the United States, they're not aware of these efforts. Of course, they appear from time to time in the headlines, but I think most of the population here, as in the US, doesn't understand how concerted of an effort this is to try to influence the foreign policy of these countries, especially in places like here or Ukraine or other countries on Russia's periphery. And so it's very important to shine a light on what's happening, how it's happening, and how these countries can protect themselves by countering some of these actions whenever it's possible. It's not always possible, but then protecting themselves too.
Did you hear some, I don't know, new points about Russian influence in Georgia or maybe some other post-Soviet countries during this conference?
Well,
something new on the table.
Yeah, so one of the things that I've been hearing a lot, which troubles me, just in the last few years, is that Russia's economic influence is starting to be more and more pronounced in Georgia. And now part of this is a good thing for Georgia. When you see more foreign direct investment, where you see more trade, you see more tourism, that means more dollars here in the economy. But with this, there also come strategic risks, and that's what I'm concerned about, with Russians buying up plots of land, buying certain strategic enterprises, companies, businesses in sectors like infrastructure, finance. Well, those have to be evaluated carefully to see if they pose risks or not, because Georgia could find itself in a place 10 years from now where it's too late, and the economic influence on this country and on its leadership is so tight that it's going to be very hard for this country to maintain its sovereignty.
Actually, that was one of the subjects I wanted to ask you about. And for example, 10 years ago, economic of Georgia was not dependent so much from Russia, because after war in 2008, Georgia started like breaking all ties with Russian economy, understanding that it's like a tool to manipulate, to put pressure and etc. So if you know, and as I understood, you know the information about what's going on now, what will be your suggestion to Georgia, maybe to Georgian government or experts you talk with today, like which is the best way to go according to maybe European experience, American experience, your experience? Where is this like border when you understand that there it is a pressure already, but not the profit?
Yeah, it's a very tricky issue, but look at the example of Finland. I think the Finns, who also share a border with Russia, have discovered the hard way that in the early 90s, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, and in the early 2000s, they allowed a lot of Russians to come in and buy land, buy businesses, without really scrutinizing who was behind some of these purchases. And they've discovered now, to their chagrin, that some of these investments have been, for example, land near strategic military facilities. There's a famous island in the Helsinki archipelago that was purchased by some shady person with ties to the Russian intelligence services. So on the one hand, Georgia needs to have some sort of process for evaluating what sorts of investments have a strategic risk to them. Some sort of committee or process where that gets evaluated. But then secondly, and probably just as importantly, Georgia needs to take a look at how to diversify its global economic footprint. And so that means trade with Russia, okay, it's necessary. Russia's a neighbor, there's nothing wrong with that. But make sure that you're also aggressively promoting your products in Western markets. Wine is a good example. After the war, a lot of the wine exports were redirected to the West. Now a lot of them are going back to Russia. Well, look at what that initial, and there's nothing wrong with selling wine to Russia, but the key here is for Georgia to profit, it needs to have high quality products. And if it sells high quality wine to Russia, great, sell it to the West as well. But make sure that you're catering to the high-end market. Same with tourism. There's nothing wrong with having Russians come here as tourists. That's great. I applaud that. But make sure that you're also marketing Georgia as a destination for French, Germans, and other West European tourists. And then, things will be more, Georgia will be more resilient.
That's really very tricky because, for example, at the moment, Georgia is in the process of inviting officially already Russian state energy company Interao to work here on the market. We have lots of such companies, and actually Georgian company who is in charge with electricity in Tbilisi here, where we are at the moment, is owned by Russian state company. So do you think that it's not some kind of valuable, profitable way to earn money, to make Georgian budget bigger when you give very important sphere of interest to Russian investors?
Well, you've just put your finger on something that I consider to be a key strategic vulnerability, which is having an asset like electricity production in the hands of a Russian state-owned company. Now, Interao has long been invested in Georgia in the Anguri Dam project, for example. That's fine if it's limited, and if it's historical, then the Georgian state has no alternative. But to allow that investment to come in now, if I were the government, I would give this a second look, because this is exactly the sort of slow, gradual, imperceptible influence that Russia has in this economy that over time, allows the Russian government to have influence over the Georgian government. And we have to be very cautious about that.
You said about promoting Georgia for Western partners, for Western countries, and etc. Could you please say what is Georgia at the moment this year for United States, for example? I mean, in DC.
Yeah, I regret to have to say this, but I think Georgia is off the map, off the radar screen for the United States. Now, the Prime Minister just had a meeting of the Strategic Dialogue with Secretary Pompeo, so we just had a very important meeting. I understand that. But in terms of senior U.S. policymakers paying attention to what's happening here and being proactively involved in supporting Georgia, but also in, giving some tough love from time to time. Unfortunately, I've seen the U.S. take a big step back over these last 2-3 years, especially.
Is it because of Georgian activities or non-activities, or because of, some changes in foreign policy of the United States?
I think it primarily has to do with changes in U.S. foreign policy under this administration. Georgia has an excellent, very active ambassador in Washington who promotes Georgia's interests. But at the same time, the last couple years in Georgia, in my opinion, have been trending in not the best direction. And unfortunately, in those circumstances, I think it's important for U.S. foreign policy to help guide Georgia, to point out where certain directions and policies are potentially counterproductive, and to steer the government into a direction that is going to be better for their Euro-Atlantic future. Sometimes that means having very difficult conversations. Please.
Do you think that in DC, people, you as well, still feel that Georgia is committed to democracy building?
I think Georgia, first of all, let me put it like this. Georgia is far and away the leader in the region. You compare Georgia to Russia or any of the other countries in this region, and it's miles ahead, miles ahead, okay? But then, what I just said is also true, which is that in the last few years, there have been some developments, and I will get to those concrete specifics in a second, that lead one to have concern about the direction the country is trending. And by those specifics, I mean independence of the judiciary, pluralism of the media, and most importantly, is concentration of economic resources in the hands of very few people, and the symbiosis between that concentration of economic resources and political power. That, so far, it has not yet caused any damage to Georgian democracy, but it has the potential to lead in an authoritarian direction. And all you have to do is look at a country like Hungary to understand how this process works. It's very dangerous for democracy over the long run.
A few days ago, Pompeo actually stated that Georgia should more actively develop the project Anaklia port. I think you've heard about it. Yeah. And Mr. Karasin, Deputy Foreign Minister of Russia, answered that it's unacceptable, and etc., etc. First of all, for the audience, how do you think, because all parts are trying to blame each other in interfering in Georgian politics or Ukrainian and etc. So how do we understand where is interference? I mean, statements of Secretary Pompeo and statements of Mr. Karasin.
Well, Secretary Pompeo is defending a U.S. strategic investment in Georgia to promote the East-West corridor, transportation corridor. Foreign Minister Karasin, Deputy Foreign Minister Karasin, is saying that a U.S. investment in Georgia is unacceptable for him. Why is it unacceptable for him? And why does he get to choose what is acceptable and what is not in terms of an investment in Georgia? You know, do we say that Interrao's investment in Georgia is unacceptable for us? No, of course, the United States would never say anything like that. So frankly, I find these kind of statements outrageous. But I think Pompeo's statement, which I fully agree with, is spot on the money. This is a strategic Western investment in Georgia. And, you know, this is the sort of thing that the Georgian government should be promoting because it is a long-term, sustainable project. If it works out, it will attract much more Western investment in Georgia. If it doesn't work out, it will send a chill throughout the Western investor community. And then, you know, Georgia's economy depends on this sort of continued investment, especially over the long run. So I think it's very strategic. I think Pompeo's right to talk it up. And I just don't understand where Karasin is coming at this from.
As we all saw, they shake hands. They said, I mean, with the Prime Minister of Georgia, they discussed several topics. And I'm just interested whether in US anyone knows what's going on with this project in Georgia where big money are invested and etc. like Anaklia port, because according to my information, it's not on the table and it's not like developing at the moment.
Well, the American foreign policy elite is paying attention to this. Most Americans, of course, don't know anything about it.
Yeah, sure.
But the foreign policy elite is paying attention because two American companies have made significant investments in this facility. As I said, it is very strategic. You know, you look at what China is doing, you look at all the patterns of trade. I mean, by China, I mean the One Belt, One Road initiative. If you look at all the patterns of East-West trade, this is potentially a key nub in that East-West corridor, which is what, you know, this was one of the primary tenets of Prime Minister Kvirikashvili, for example's economic development plan. It makes a lot of sense. And, you know, this is in Georgia's interest in the long run. Really
this is in Georgian interest, but as I understand, it's not working at the moment. So money are invested, but whereas any results?
So there are some questions as to whether the government can guarantee certain types of throughput and trade. Those are legitimate questions, I have to say. My advice to the government would be, if you truly understand the strategic value of this, then you have to step up. Because that's what countries like China, for example, do, is when the government of China sees a strategic importance to something, they step in and they guarantee that investment. We see it all the time with most Chinese investments. Same goes for Japan, same goes for the United States and other countries. So this is a responsibility for the government to really see this project through to completion.
Secretary Pompeo also stated that Georgia should be or must be invited to the NATO alliance as soon as possible without any conditions and etc. Do you think that, first of all, that the United States can solve this problem alone as a leading country in the NATO? And is there such a desire in the United States?
Well, I personally welcomed Pompeo's comment about this aspect of integration with NATO. To answer your question, no, the U.S. can't do this alone. The U.S. does have to exert a leadership role in NATO to convince some of the skeptics that the time is right for Georgia to enter the alliance and that Georgia has met most of the benchmarks for accession. I think it's entirely possible that the United States could do that. Unfortunately, right now, President Trump has alienated so many of our NATO allies that our standing within the alliance, ours, meaning the U.S. standing, is the lowest it's ever been if you look at opinion poll numbers. And so our ability to convince France, Germany, Spain, some of the skeptics, are going to be much more difficult now than a few years earlier. But one could easily foresee a moment in the not too distant future where the U.S. is able to step up and advocate for Georgia, and who knows, maybe we could succeed. So I would not say that it's not possible in the next few years for Georgia to enter NATO. Now, after North Macedonia becomes a member, Georgia is next in line. Bosnia politically is in real trouble. It's a basket case. Ukraine is the population, the president said there's going to be a referendum. I don't think that, frankly, most European countries are ready for Ukraine yet, hopefully in the future, but not yet. So Georgia's next.
The question about Ukraine, maybe you've heard about discussion, as I know there is such a discussion in the United States about providing Ukraine with this non-NATO major ally status instead of NATO membership at the moment. Do you know, is it on the table in the United States? And secondly, why Georgia is not on the list?
So it is on the table, and I think it's going to happen very soon. And I think it's a good thing for Ukraine. But I have to let your viewers know what major non-NATO allied status entails. It doesn't mean as much as some people think it does. It does not provide, most importantly, it does not provide a security guarantee from the United States. What it does is it gives countries that have this status preferential access to U.S. security assistance. And that's really it. So it sounds like a lot more than it really is. But having said that, it's still very good that Ukraine will receive this soon.
But sorry, can we say that, for example, if some country had this status, it is much more difficult for other country, let's say like this, to threaten such kind of a partner?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I mean, let's not forget, some of the countries that have this status include Pakistan and Argentina. So it's not as if, some of our close allies have it too, like Israel, but there's also some countries that are diverse that are not necessarily as close. I don't think it's a disincentive to Russian aggression, but it certainly does provide that preferential access to security assistance, which is valuable.
Why we don't have such a project on the table? Georgia, I mean.
Well, so first of all, it's not off the table, and it could be something that Georgia pursues. I think in the past, this status has been seen as an alternative to NATO. And so countries that are aspirants to NATO membership have not requested this status. That said, I think Georgia would benefit from it and could, in fact, have this status. But at the same time, I know that Georgia receives preferential treatment already in terms of the security assistance that we provide. So, at the end of the day, I think the U.S.-Georgian bilateral military relationship is very strong and as strong as it's ever been now. So that's a real positive.
So how would you as a final question, how would you evaluate current status of Georgia-U.S. relations? We understand that we have lots of cooperation in military sphere and etc. But we don't have ambassador for a year, I believe. More, yeah. Actually, not all other countries of the region, they have already U.S. ambassador, not here. From the other hand, Secretary Pompeo meets Prime Minister Baghdadze and etc. We here cannot understand what's going on between Georgia and the United States actually, because we all know about working of these groups, bilateral groups, I mean like in military sphere and etc. But we don't see any normal active dialogue. Do you think it is like this? There is no such a dialogue?
So I'll try to summarize how I see the relationship right now. As I said before, I think Georgia has fallen off the radar for the senior leaders in the United States in the Trump administration. But what the good news, that's the bad news, is that basically very few people in Washington are paying attention to what's happening in Georgia these days. And that's why we haven't had an ambassador for so long, because it hasn't been a priority to have someone here. If it were a priority, we could have someone here tomorrow. But the good news is that the bureaucracy in Washington heavily favors cooperation with Georgia. And so, for example, the Pentagon, when I was in the Pentagon, we started even more intense bilateral security cooperation. And that has continued under Secretary Mattis, and it continues today. But it's run by professional bureaucrats. So even though the top layer is not... They keep doing it, and they're invested because we have great professional ties between our military, Georgia's military, and the same goes for other spheres as well. So that continues at the lower level. Unfortunately, at the higher level, the ties of, there's just not as much attention to the issue.
Understood. I want to use this interview for you to express your opinion about today you take part in the conference about Russian influence in the post-Soviet space, and in Georgia we have lots of processes at the moment, such as I don't want to say word conflict, but tensions between Georgia and Azerbaijan, some topics related to Armenia, and etc., etc. So, according to your understanding, I know that you know about such topics. What is the reason of these processes, and do you have some, again, suggestions to Georgia how to act, how to counter such threats?
Well, I think some of the trends that are happening in this country are very dangerous, and there is, frankly, from a strategic perspective, no need to have bilateral disputes right now between Georgia and Azerbaijan. This is artificial. This is completely concocted, and it's counterproductive for Georgia. The same goes for some of these right-wing protests against the LGBT community here in Tbilisi. Look,
initiated by Russian businessmen.
Well, look, there is a large segment of Georgian society that is more traditionally oriented and that doesn't see, that frankly doesn't accept LGBT rights. And that's a problem. But almost more of a problem is the fact that Russia, and especially the FSB and the security services, they love this issue because it's a great wedge issue to be able to try to tell the Georgian society that the West is decadent, it's too individualistic. Georgia belongs with Russia and the Ruski Mir, and so it's a perfect issue for the FSB and for other organizations like that to try to play up and to stir up. And so I'm not saying Russia invented this group, and Mr. Vasadze and all those various people who try to foment this, but they certainly benefit from it, and it's bad for Georgia, and it's bad for Georgia's Euro-Atlantic prospects when these sorts of dangers, and the same goes for tensions with Armenia and Azerbaijan. Only one party really benefits from that, and that's Moscow.
Thanks a lot for the interview. Thank you.
My pleasure.